How many times did they actually meet, those famous lovers, Goethe and Bettina? She came to visit him again later that year in the autumn of 1807 and stayed in Weimar for 10 days. Then she didn't see him again until 3 years later. She came for 3 days to the Bohemian spa of Teplitz, without realizing that Goethe was also there for a cure in the healing waters. And a year later came that fateful 2-week Weimar visit, at the end of which Christiane knocked off her glasses. And how many times had they actually been alone together, face to face? 3, 4 times, hardly more. The less they saw of each other, the more they wrote, or more precisely, the more she wrote to him. She wrote him 52 lengthy letters, in which she addressed him with the familiar du and spoke of nothing but love. Except for this avalanche of words, however, nothing else actually happened, and we can only ask ourselves why their love story became so famous. This is the answer. It became famous because from the very beginning it concerned nothing else but love. Goethe soon began to sense that. He got his first disturbing inkling when Bettina revealed that already, long before her first visit to Weimar, she had become close friends with his aged mother, who also lived in Frankfurt. Bettina kept asking questions about her son, and the old lady, pleased and flattered, would spend all day recounting dozens of recollections. Bettina thought that her friendship with his mother would open Goethe's house to her, as well as his heart. That calculation proved not quite correct. His mother's adoring love struck Goethe as somewhat comical. He never even bothered to pay her a visit from Weimar. And he sniffed danger in the alliance of an extravagant girl and a naive mother. I imagine he must have experienced mixed feelings when Bettina repeated to him the stories she had heard from the old lady. At first he was, of course, flattered by the interest shown in him by a young woman. Her stories awoke many slumbering memories that pleased him. But soon he also found among them some anecdotes that could not possibly have happened, or that made him seem so ridiculous that they should not have happened. Moreover, coming from Bettina's lips, his childhood and youth took on a certain coloration and meaning that made him uncomfortable. Not because Bettina might wish to use these childhood memories against him, but rather because any person, not just Goethe, finds it distasteful to hear his life recounted with a different interpretation from his own. Goethe thus found himself threatened. The girl who associated with the young intellectuals of the Romantic movement, for whom Goethe hadn't the least sympathy, seemed dangerously ambitious and took it for granted, with an aplomb bordering on shamelessness, that she would be a writer. One day she actually said it outright. She wanted to write a book based on his mother's recollections, a book about him, about Goethe. He recognized at once that behind the expressions of love lurked the menacing aggressiveness of the pen, and that put him on his guard. But just because he was constantly on his guard with her, he did everything he could to avoid being unpleasant. He couldn't afford to turn her into an enemy. She was too dangerous. He preferred to keep her under constant, kind control. But he knew at the same time that even kindliness must not be overdone, because the slightest gesture that she could interpret as an expression of loving favor, and she was ready to interpret his every sneeze as a declaration of love, would make her even more daring. Once she wrote to him, "Don't burn my letters, don't tear them up. That might hurt you, for the love I express in them is tied to you firmly, truly, vitally. But don't show them to anyone. Keep them hidden, like a secret beauty." First he smiled condescendingly at the self-assurance with which Bettina considered her letters to be like a beauty, but then he was struck by the sentence, "But don't show them to anyone." Why did she say that to him? Do you have the slightest desire to show them to anyone? By that imperative, "don't show," Bettina betrayed her secret desire to show. He could not doubt that the letters he wrote to her from time to time would eventually have other readers as well, and he knew that he was in the position of an accused being warned by the court, "Anything you say from now on may be used against you." He therefore tried to chart a careful middle way between kindliness and restraint. His replies to her ecstatic letters were at the same time friendly and restrained, and for a long time he countered her familiar "du" with the formal "si." When they found themselves together in the same town, he was kindly in a fatherly way, invited her to his house, but he tried to make sure they would always be in the presence of other people. What then was at stake between them? In 1809, Bettina wrote to him, "I have a strong will to love you for eternity." Read carefully this apparently banal sentence. More important than the word love are the words eternity and will. I won't keep you in suspense any longer. What was at stake between them was not love, it was immortality. In 1810, in the course of those 3 days when the two of them accidentally found themselves together in Teplitz, she admitted to him that she would soon marry the poet Achim von Arnim. She probably made the announcement with some embarrassment, for she was not sure whether Goethe would take her marriage as a betrayal of the love she had been so ecstatically proclaiming. She didn't know enough about men to guess the quiet joy the news would bring to Goethe. Right after Bettina's departure, he wrote a letter to Christiane in Weimar with this cheerful sentence: "Mit Arnim ist wohl gewiss." With Arnim, it's quite certain. In the same letter, he rejoices that Bettina was on this occasion really prettier and nicer than before, and we can guess why she seemed so to him. He was sure that the existence of a husband would from now on shield him from the extravagances that had prevented him from appreciating her charms and a relaxed and good-humored frame of mind. In order to understand this situation, we mustn't forget one important consideration. From his earliest youth, Goethe had been a womanizer. And so by the time he met Bettina, he had been a womanizer for 40 years continuously. During this time, there had developed inside him a mechanism of seductive reactions and gestures that could be activated by the slightest impulse. Until now, he had kept it in check with Bettina with enormous difficulty, but when he realized that with Arnim it's quite certain, he told himself with relief that his caution was no longer necessary. She came to his room that evening, once again with the air of a child. She told him some anecdote or other in a delightfully naughty way, and while he remained seated in his armchair, she sat down facing him on the floor. Being in a good mood, with Arnim it's quite certain, he leaned toward her and patted her cheek the way we pat a child. At that moment the child fell silent and lifted to him eyes full of womanly longing and insistence. He clasped her hands and lifted her from the floor. Don't forget the scene. He was seated, she stood facing him, and in the window the sun was setting. She was gazing into his eyes, he was gazing into hers. The mechanism of seduction was set in motion, and he did not resist it. In a voice somewhat lower than usual, and continuing to gaze into her eyes, he asked her to bare her bosom. She didn't say anything. She didn't do anything. She blushed. He got up from the chair and unbuttoned the front of her dress. She kept gazing into his eyes, and the red of the sunset merged with the blush that ran down her skin to the very pit of her stomach. He placed his hand on her breast. "Has anyone ever touched your breast?" he asked her. "No," she answered. "It seems so strange when you touch me." And all the time she kept gazing into his eyes. Without removing his hand from her breast, he too kept gazing into her eyes, savoring long and avidly in their depths the shame of a girl whose breast no one had ever touched before. This is approximately how Bettina herself recorded the scene, which probably had no sequel and remained in the midst of their story, more rhetorical than erotic, the sole exquisite jewel of sexual arousal.